So what we're going to do is talk about a couple things for each tank, give my kind of summary of where they're at in Shadowlands, and then we'll be answering very specific questions that have been asked either by the community or by direct viewers, and hopefully give you guys the insight that you've been asking about. We're going to go over a few things. This is what the list is going to be. Overall feel, the biggest change, the strengths of the spec, the weaknesses of the spec, the outlook on the spec compared to previous expansions, where they might potentially shake out in any meta competition, and also why should you pick this tank specifically. So let's get right into it. So we'll start with my main and the class that I played the most on the Shadowlands beta, that being the Blood Death Knight. So the overall feel really isn't that different from Battle for Azeroth, and I think personally that's a good thing. I always worry about a kit like this that's really finesse, that you worry that if they change one or two small things, it's going to really impact how the class plays. And for the most part, they really haven't made any big changes to the class. However, they did make some small changes that are going to have a pretty big impact. So if I had to say what the biggest change was, I might have a tie between Ossuary becoming a baseline part of the kit that we are going to get. Currently do not have that in the pre-patch, but you will have that while you level as a perk. And also anti-magic zone. I feel like that's probably one of the biggest tank changes that has happened in this expansion. It's really going to help Blood DK in certain types of content. Their biggest strength remains to be their flexibility against all types of content. They bring a lot of really valuable utility, and that's only gotten stronger in Shadowlands. They have a lot of niche usages where they could really outplay certain things, like with AMS or now even AMZ, and also things like Gorfien's Grasp, Grip of the Dead, things that really stand out in their kit, you know. And when you have those options, then they become almost mandatory in certain situations, and that really maybe helps propel Blood DK into the forefront. There's always been fights like this where Death Grip has been really valuable. We saw 2 expansions at the end tier in BOD. We saw a fight like Mechatork where having even an alt Blood DK was more valuable than having any other tank in that role. We saw it on Hivemind again, same thing. Even having a third Blood DK who literally had no gear but was just there to grip things was always valuable. Stuff like that is always intangible. We saw it even in Legion and previous expansions too. I remember Mop as well, especially. So it's always been there. Death Grip's always just kind of this intangible thing. I feel like Blood DK has a lot of that. Vamp Blood, AMS, AMZ now especially. These are really intangible strengths of the class. Unfortunately, in terms of their biggest weakness, it seems to always be unpredictable amounts of physical damage. The class plays really well when you know exactly what's happening and you could predict and make decisions around it. But in those certain circumstances where you cannot keep up with the damage, they're extremely ineffective. In fact, I would say that they're really flawed in that way, design-wise, because if they ever had to fight something that they had no hope of surviving on their own end, they really just can't tank it. This has kind of been the opposite of Brewmaster in many ways, whereas Brewmaster's always been looked at as the best progression tank, the best tank for times when you are uncertain if you can survive, because they're kit just naturally allows them to deal with it. And Blood DK is really quite the opposite, famously that way in BFA, and also probably going to be that way in Shadowlands, although they did have many things to help blend their kit better with things like Rune Tap. But all in all, the class remains to be one of the most complicated tanks, one of the hardest to play, and you have to do a lot of planning to be able to play it well. So it might not be worth it for many people to be thinking this much about a tank. They would rather just take the more standard route, and instead they might look at this as a weakness of the class. Now, in terms of how they compare directly to BFA, I think they are just better in every way. Their overall defensive kit has improved with things like Rune Tap and AMZ and all these other changes to Vamp Blood and Red Thirst being buffed and a variety of things that I've covered over the months. But I would say the main thing for me was that they really lacked a lot of fun customizable stuff. In Legion, they had a lot of it. The legendary systems in Legion really were fun to customize the class, and I think that is coming back really well, especially for DK. They have some of the best legendaries. I really love the fact that there's so many different options for them, especially compared to some other tanks. If you look at like Brewmaster, for example, they really don't have any fun ones, anything that you could see, maybe I use this for that, maybe use this for that. Blood DK has so much of that stuff, and that is why I think I'm really going to enjoy them. I enjoyed them in BFA, but now that there's even more decision making like that, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. But in terms of their place in the meta, they'll probably still be a moderately successful pick. I think especially for Mythic Plus, they're still going to be looked down upon, even though they have improved dramatically from BFA. A lot of other tanks have improved even more dramatically, especially when you look at Vengeance, and I think that their lack of flexibility against physical damage that you can't necessarily prepare for or keep up with is going to really hold them back in the first season at least. But in terms of rating, I think they're going to be a very good pick because AMZ, many of the other things like I talked about, Gorfien's and Death Grip always being valuable in certain fights. They have very good spread AoE now too, especially if you want to take certain legendaries and combinations, and I think there's plenty to be optimistic about with the kit and overall outlook for Shadowlands. But so why should you pick this tank? For me, Blood DK is the thinking man's tank. It requires requires a lot of effort, and I'm not the best at it, but it's really rewarding when you make the right choice, especially in the face of a time where maybe a healer dies or the group is falling apart, and you could kind of pull out a big play and show that, man, if you do this right, it could be really self-sustained, really big impact on any, especially in small group content. I feel like this happens a lot, but if you're sure that you like a self-healing tank and you're thinking a little bit more about where the utility could fit in, you're not constantly just only worried about either offense or defense, what can you bring to the table besides those things, then Blood DK is a really solid pick. Next, we'll talk about Vengeance Demon Hunter, and the overall feel is clear. It's got one of the most fun windows of any tank spec that I've ever played under any iteration, and that being Fell Devastation with Demonic Talent. Really, the biggest change for me might be that too, although you could say a lot of smaller numerical changes as well have gone into the class that are really propelling it up. It's been kind of gradually being buffed over the last 2 years, maybe even 4 years if you look really far back, and it never really had that pizzazz, but now this time they finally have a really fun combination of toys. They have some really good interaction with conduits and soulbinds, especially the Covenant Kyrian, where you saw some really insane things come out somewhat recently on the beta. Some slight nerfs, but still always going to be an offensive focused tank. They're always going to bring a lot of burst offense, and for a lot of people that's really exciting to them. They also have one of the widest defensive and utility kits that exist right now for small group content, and that's something that I've been saying for years now. People have just been almost brushing it off like if it doesn't matter. Now they're finally realizing it, how with this type of buff, these classes can actually matter more than just whether or not they do good offense or good defense. They can bring a lot more to the table. The biggest weakness is still, though, they have maybe still some inconsistent defense. I think you might find this to be problematic in some content. They're kind of on the middle of both ends. You know, they're not really a pure reactionary tank, and they're not really a pure preventative tank. They're kind of in between both. They can do a lot of healing, and they also kind of rely on a lot of their big defensives like meta, and maybe a little bit too much at times. So if you're a new player to tanking and you make the wrong decisions with these defensives, then you kind of are struggling to keep up with the actual healing requirement. Whereas, maybe a tank like Blood DK is a little bit more focused on the healing, so you really aren't in that situation. You're not really thinking about two different worlds. And then kind of like Brewmaster or Bear, they're just all they're all defense, so you're only really worried about that. You're letting the healers do the work. But in terms of sheer weakness, I'm not sure I could find one. Like, really, they have a very complete kit. They're looking to be very strong in Shadowlands, and especially for small group content, they're looking like they're set up to dominate. Maybe the biggest weakness is that's the case. They might end up being the targeted nurse, but I think it's easy to look at them as kind of the prot warriors from BFA carried over to Shadowlands here, because they're going to really have a potent kit for small group content. And in raids, like they'll be good, they'll be solid in raids, nothing really too crazy. Really, that's kind of in terms of the past, like outlook to the past. They've only gotten better in 5-mans. I wouldn't really say they've gotten dramatically better in raids. Obviously, a high value offensive tank is always going to be good, but I still don't really feel like they bring a ton to raids. I'm not really sure, especially with all this focus on, kind of offensive burst offense, what that even looks like in a raid. When, if the second tank isn't able to keep up with that, there's going to be a lot of confusion and a lot of complications there. So, but we'll see. I think for the most part that they have vastly improved. They're probably the most improved tank right now. And it's kind of just been a small accumulation of things that have kind of added up over time that really keep them at this forefront of this discussion. As long as they retain this kind of offensive prowess, I think they're always going to be looked at as a good tank. So their place in the meta is basically what I've been getting at. It really is just 5-mans. They're going to crush 5-mans. They're really looking really solid in 5. And I think they've been really good for 5-mans for a really long time. I don't understand why people didn't agree with that, but I think this expansion is finally going to take hold. And then, like I said, in raids, I just don't necessarily see them making a huge splash. We'll see, what the top guilds do, but I don't think they have that like intangible benefit to being brought to a raid. They're a solid pick, but I think for the most part, they're going to really look solid in small group content. So why should you play this tank? Extremely active tank. They have an incredibly wide array of different ways that you could interact with scenarios, not only just defensively, but offensively, of course, and also with tons of different types of utility. It's a very, very wide kit. And it's almost ironic that people look at Demon Hunter as a 2-button spec when a single tank spec has this much that they could interact with. So if you're kind of like interested in the kind of maybe like self-healing as a main tenement of a core tank spec, but you're not necessarily in love with blood, I would say probably give Vengeance a try, especially if you're somebody who loves to leap around and do all kinds of wild things that Demon Hunter are able to do. Next, we'll talk about Guardian Druid or Bear, and to me, they feel very authentic. They feel very true to what they've always meant to be, and it's just gotten better in Shadowlands. They're, this hulking bear walking around. It's just so freaking cool to see this. And now that they're a little bit stronger, they have a lot better outlook on overall types of damage. Some legendaries that are just really going to make a big impact for them, and I think they're really a slam dunk too with certain soul binds. Bear just seems like it's really on the up and up, and that's maybe the first time I've said that in a couple years now, so it's really nice. The biggest change is just that they actually have really good legendaries. They're going to have a really strong couple options, and I think they're probably going to be looked at as some of the best legendaries in the game, not only just for tanks, but in the whole game. They're having a really big impact on their kit, and it's quite noticeable if, say, you played with no legendaries. So maybe if you're playing a Bear at the very beginning of the expansion, you won't feel this way, but if you look at beta testing, you'll see that they have a couple really cool designs in some of their legendaries and how they might interact with soul binds and talents and some other things. In terms of strength, it's definitely going to be physical bulk this time around, always is, but they're really coming to the forefront with it now with some changes to Pra and especially Brewmaster 2. Bear looks like it could be really set to dominate, especially with the Ironbark legendary and some of the talent and soulbind setups they can take. I think they might actually be the best physically defensive tank, but their weakness will probably still be single target DPS, overall mobility, a little weak on that front always, depending I guess on which covenant you pick. But in terms of when you're thinking about a Bear, you're really never thinking like, oh my god, they're going to top the offensive charts, but they really can now with some of the legendaries and soulbinds and stuff. They can do a lot of AoE, and they always could, especially in the middle of BFA. As season 2, they were really looking crazy with AoE, but it's going to be a little bit more of a focus now, beneficially for both defense and offense with some of the options. And I would just say, like, if you're kind of a tank that's like looking to be multi-dimensional, you like to do a lot of things besides just sit there and take big physical hits, then maybe Bear's still a little boring. I think for the most part, Bear's still looked at as pretty boring. Even though it might be numerically strong, it's probably gonna not interest a lot of people for that reason. But in terms of compared to the past, oh my god, they are so much stronger. Even though I still think Vengeance is the most improved tank, its Bear is right behind it, and they have some really cool design features coming. Some, like I said, between new talent changes and legendaries and other stuff, I think it's pretty fresh. Place in the meta though, I think they're going to comfortably be, kind of maybe right behind Vengeance and 5-man, a very capable tank, especially for those groups who are maybe a little bit off the top, where they're thinking about maybe survival of the tank first and foremost. They're thinking about ways to maximize that first before they're worried about pure offense. Like Vengeance's offense is really flashy and it looks really insane, and even though their defense might be a little shaky at times, it kind of gets by because of that almost overtuned offensive element, where Bear's kind of the opposite, right? They're almost overtuned defensively. So if you find that to be attractive, then that might be why you should play this tank. I think especially in small group content, it's really going to stand out. And even in raids, I mean, Bear Druid is an amazing pick for raids because they have some useful utility. Bringing a battle res as a tank is always nice, especially, but Stampeding Roar, even though now it's an option for the other Druid specs, it's always nice to have that in the Guardian role. Having a couple of these small utilities and things that you can bring to raids are really going to add up. So if you like a tank that's kind of got a really strong, almost identity to it, where you see that and you know exactly what that guy's playing when he's playing it, it's a Bear. It absolutely is. There's nothing else that you could say about that spec, right? Like, that is the key element that defines the spec. But unfortunately, if you're maybe looking for a more active tank, some tank that has a lot of flexibility and diversity in their actual defensive rotation or even in their offensive rotation, sadly, Bear's probably not for you. Let's talk now about the Protection Warrior. So very flashy tank in Battle for Azeroth, and unfortunately a very dull one in Shadowlands, in my opinion at least. I don't really feel like the class of warrior got any big changes, anything really sexy coming into Shadowlands. And even though I do like the overall kit and some of the changes that might be pervasive through leveling a warrior, I don't really feel like they really stand out at max level. In fact, compared to some of the other kits, I'd say they have gone backwards. So maybe the biggest change for warrior is the fact that they've gotten nerfed in so many different ways. That it's so many interactive talents that really made a big impact on the kit, and things like Azerite traits really helping them, that all of that being gone might feel like you're playing a different class. There's a lot of weaknesses now that maybe weren't exposed before, that were kind of covered up by the flashiness that they had in offense and defense. But if you've been playing pre-patch, you've probably seen this the whole time. So their biggest strength is probably still going to be physical offense, maybe also physical defense, even though I do feel like they took a pretty big step back. The the overall idea of being able to block is always going to be valuable in certain circumstances. You could look back as far as Legion to see that there was some physical mechanics that they could actually block that other tanks would have a struggle to deal with. So there might be some really big moments there, but outside of, you know, any big offensive or even utility moments, I don't really see like Warrior being like a top pick, you know what I mean? So the weaknesses is their lack of an identity. I feel like really, you know, especially against Magic and kind of the common themes that are present in Shadowlands dungeons and also raids too, you know, this spread cleave, kind of apply something that kind of spreads out. They don't really have a lot of this. And now that they're in a weakened state compared to Shadowlands, I think a lot of people are going to be maybe searching for an identity for Warrior. So compared to the past, they really just don't have that. I think it's almost sad how bad, you know, the Warrior's identity was very, very strong in Battle for Azeroth. And a lot of that was just simply because they were overtuned in some ways. They had a lot of interactions that simply were overtuned, objectively too strong numerically compared to their, you know, other options or predecessors even. But then you kind of look back to Legion and you start to see a lot more of this. It's almost like a failure of the design of the class or the spec in general, because if you don't have an identity, you have no niche, and having no niche is the death, and especially in five-man content, you know, or even in raids, you know, you can only bring 2 tanks. So if you're really thinking about which one to play, you might not be thinking about Warrior because, oh, they don't bring anything specific. Like, why should we bring a Warrior? Well, they bring some things that Fury or Arms could bring, and other than that, they're just maybe a weaker version, sadly to say, of Bear or even Brewmaster or other tanks right now that are specializing in physical. So where their meta place is going to be, I have to say it's probably just going to be at the bottom, unfortunately. They're still going to be really good defensively, especially against physical things. So, you know, there's a lot of competing arguments being made about Blood DK, and you could maybe say like, well, they're better in these circumstances than Blood DK is. But then when you compare the overall kit to really any other tank, you just see a lack of anything that's really flashy, something that you really want to bring. And I think that's just ultimately the kiss of death for a meta, because if you have no niche, you cannot be considered for any specific content, because there's always going to be a situation like maybe you need a battle res, you bring a DK or a Bear. Maybe you need, you know, maybe you're really focused on big AoE offense. That's not necessarily what they're doing best anymore. They're still, you know, they're still capable. They're still probably an above average offensive tank, and certainly an above average defensive tank in terms of, you know, compared to some of the other kits out there right now. But they're pretty straightforward, and I don't think a lot of people who love them in BFA are going to like them today. So why should you play Warrior? Because you don't care about any of that. Because you like a Warrior. You like somebody who's going to charge in, who's going to raise their shield, who's going to hit the guy in the throat with their shield to interrupt them. The kit is pretty freaking cool looking, I have to say. Even though I don't necessarily like it, and it's arguably the tank I like the least, and has been for a while, there's just something visceral about it, isn't there? Like when you see a Warrior playing as especially like maybe like an Orc or a Tauren or something kind of imposing, maybe a Draenei, you really get this feeling like, wow, that guy's actually, he's like a bolstered, you know, dude decked out in armor playing the game. So it's kind of pretty fun. The whole concept of Warrior is still something I really resonate with. I'm just not necessarily sure I like where their current place is or necessarily identify with where they're going. So now let's talk about the Protection Paladin. Unfortunately, this is the tank I was the most excited about coming from the alpha into the beta, and ended up being the tank that I like the least now probably. The overall feel of them is just not very fun for me. It's a little clunky, honestly. I feel like a lot of people are focusing on their offensive output, and that really comes at the cost of their defensive output at times. Even though they have some really, really cool spells, I'm just not necessarily in love with it. But I'll tell you what, they have some of the coolest legendaries and covenant abilities in the game. They have some really flashy ideas, and I think the overall concept of a paladin is still pretty true today. The main thing I really wanted to see was them become more of a, almost like a support tank again. Even if you follow back to the early days, paladin has always been about like, oh man, what can they bring to help others? Not necessarily about like how strong they are individually. So even though that's kind of just how the game has shifted, I've always liked that concept for prop paladin. And they, you know, in MoP, they were really support oriented. Even in Legion, they could be looked at as really support oriented. And I think even in Shadowlands, they can still be looked that way. It's just almost like they got over nerfed because so many ridiculous offensive changes happened. And now I kind of feel like maybe they just have the worst overall kit for tanking. Like it just, I'm not sure what they do best. Like the biggest change might not even exist. I can't really think of one, you know what I mean? Like there's no strength or anything that I think like, wow, Prop Pally is really good in this area. But you know, if you had to say one, they still have some really good, like, you know, having an immunity as a tank. I know I say this a lot and people maybe think I'm like crazy or something like that, but like out of my years of raiding, if I could have had an immunity as a tank, I would really have a different outlook on the whole game. Like it's a really big deal. So, you know, these kind of things aren't really that useful day to day, but it can make certain scenarios, like when I played a Holy Paladin as a healer, I used bubble all the time to either cheese a mechanic, run through something that I shouldn't. It kind of just made life easier. And I never really understood why, things like this for Paladin, having potentially like a cheat death and a bubble and some like lay on hands and potentially good group healing. It's like, why don't people like these more? And I think it's because a lot of people play tank maybe a little selfishly. They're playing it because they think like, oh, it makes me a little bit more important and all I care about is myself, So for me, that's always kind of been the thing that I wanted to see from Prop Paladin, but maybe the overarching community look on it has kind of led Blizzard away from that. So in terms of weaknesses, I would say that, they're almost inconsistent defensively. That's maybe the thing I like the least about any tank right now, is that I feel like it is pretty hard to be consistent with their defense, even though they have a lot of good options, new talents, new legendaries, new covenants, new soulbind stuff that really help them bolster that. I just feel like compared to the other 6 tanks, they're just the tank that is the least consistent defensively. You don't really know what you're gonna get from Prop Paladin at times. Like, well, okay, here's so Blood DK's situation. Like I would say, imagine if Blood Boil was your main offensive or your main defensive spell. You know what I mean? Like that's maybe the comparison here. Like you have to choose between offense and defense. You have to choose if you want to use wings for pure offense, wings for pure defense. And these decisions aren't necessarily fun for me as like a lay person playing Paladin. Somebody who doesn't play it a lot, I don't really get a lot of enjoyment out of that. So, but compared to the past, I do really like the fact that they're trying to be a little bit more creative with the Paladin niche. They got, the auras back and some other cool, really, I think you guys are really gonna like some of the conduits and stuff. At least I personally like them. Maybe they're not gonna be necessarily that strong mathematically and people won't take them, but they have some really rich flavor in there between that and legendaries. And overall, the whole concept of a Paladin seems like it's gonna, especially Kyrian Prop Paladin, I think you're gonna really see when you're throwing all these shields around, if you're picking that, it's just gonna be really rewarding visually too. It's kind of splendorous almost just to see these, the Kyrian in Paladin form. It seems perfect for that. So in terms of place in the meta, for a while they were really looking competitive. I think in 5-mans they probably can still be. Their offense is a big factor, and for some reason this is really high flavor right now. Everybody's kind of worried about offense, and I would say that Prop Paladin still is a very good offensive candidate. They've always been, and they probably always will be, just because of how wings works and how their overall kit works, but it comes at a cost. You have to be sure that what you're getting is valuable. And I mean, compared to Vengeance and maybe even like something like Warrior, I just don't really think you're getting that value for it, because you're directly trading defense at times that could potentially open up to a mistake that might lead to your death. So if you're not a pro player, the place in the meta might not be relevant for this pick. But in terms of rating, I think they're going to be maybe below average kind of tank. They still have that option. Like I said, man, I'm telling you that immunity is not something to write out. Spell warding as well has been really impactful in the past. And there's a lot of things to be thinking about when you're playing a Prop Paladin. But I just, again, it's one of those things kind of like Prop Warrior. I just don't really feel like, hey, I definitely want a Prop Paladin for these things. They don't really exist for me. But why should you play a Prop Paladin? I think this is probably the best example of why you should play something for fun, because this expansion, they have a lot of really fun things coming for the Paladin class in general. Even though it's kind of on the downturn in both tanking and even healing. I'm not necessarily sure where Rhett stands, but it just seems like such a great expansion for a Paladin. Don't you guys think that like Bastion as a zone and Kyrian as a covenant, it just fits them so well? I love it. I love the concept. I really like the way that the abilities and the stuff that goes on with that covenant interact with the Paladin class as well. It just feels very rich. The fantasy is very strong this expansion for me. So if you're not necessarily worried about pure offense or defense or anything, like, you're not worried about parses and you're just looking to have fun, I think this might actually be the most flavorful tank this expansion. Finally, Brewmaster Monk. Now, if you ever listen to me talk about tanks, you'll know that in the old days, Brewmaster was one of my favorite tanks, and now it's been changed to be one of my least favorite tanks. But back with Shadowlands is a concept that I really, really, really like, and I think Brewmaster is really fun right now. I love the concept of Celestial Brew, used to be called Guard, but it really kind of interacted with the Vengeance mechanic, not the spec, but the mechanic from Mop, in such a way that it made it almost feel like a lot like Blood DK. So even though I really like that, and some of the other things concerning Brewmaster, like Clash returning and just the overall kit in general, I still don't really feel like it's going to be for me in Shadowlands, but I can see myself playing it again. That's a good start. And to me, the overall field, though, it maybe feels a little bit of a weird identity right now. Like, they have this really powerful absorb, but people are saying that like you should only use it at certain times. It's kind of like they just, their kit has kind of stayed the same, but they got this added on top of it because they took Iron Skin Brew, which I absolutely could not stand. It's just a really passive defensive ability, and they added that almost directly passively to the class, and now they added this on top of it. So it's almost just like a flat buff, but compared to some of the other tanks, maybe it's a little bit harder to use. It's harder to understand when you should use it. For me, I like it as like a really nice, oh, I'm predicting this big hit, I'm going to use it and take 0 damage from it effectively. So unfortunately, they nerfed it a couple times along the way, and it kind of turned me off. But in general, I feel like Brewmaster is so much better than it was in the past. It's actually palatable, where I hated it before. And the biggest change is clearly Celestial Brew. I mean, that's maybe the biggest change for any tank. Obviously, you can point to some of the other things we've talked about, and this list is bigger, but Celestial Brew is just such a big change for Brewmaster, especially now considering how they also changed the way magic is going to work for them with stagger. It's a very interesting thing. I'm very interested in seeing how this changes the whole overall concept of Brewmaster being like the best progression tank, and again, that being the tank that deals with damage that you're not necessarily certain you can survive the easiest, right? Like if you don't know for sure that this auto attack is going to kill you, then Brewmaster is just the best for this. But if you do know it's not going to kill you and you need to know how to respond to that, then you know, like a tank like Blood DK or Vengeance is better because you react to it and deal with it that way. So Brewmaster is very the opposite of that, and I think that's one of their weaknesses. Like the fact that that is in place, it kind of limits what else they can do. Like Blizzard can't just give them all the tools. So that's always the thing that I like the least about Brewmaster, is how they kind of respond to magic damage in general, but also how they kind of just respond to their own health pool. Like it's almost assumed that they're so overpowered, kind of this natural state of stagger, that they can't be given strong self-healing, or they can't be given strong self-sustain tools. And it has gotten better in Shadowlands, I would say, but in terms of, you know, where other tanks are, it's just nowhere close. And for me, that I looked at that as a weakness, because I've always, like, you know, especially playing a Blood DK, very high health pool, very high self-sustain. You walk into a pack, and as long as you play well, you don't feel like you're in danger. But there's times on a monk that I feel like I do play at least, you know, as well as I can, given the experience I have, and there's times I'm still just in danger. So I was really hoping that that was what Celestial Brew was going to sheer up. Instead, it's kind of just turned into like a, you know, a relatively standard defensive. I like the concept of it, but it doesn't really solve the big problem for me. So compared to the past, though, unbelievably better for me. Whether or not the group, you know, like the mentality of bringing a Brewmaster to every group for raiding and stuff like that is going to be the same thought process, I don't really know, because never really did that in our guild anyway. But it's still a really potent tank, a tank that you're going to have a lot of upsides to seeing in a group. 5-mans though, you know, so the place in the meta, it's a little concerning to me, because you know, if you looked back in BFA, you can see Brewmaster really sturdy, really a tank that was kind of up the ladder a lot, and that was more because they were just so good defensively. They brought some key utility like Ring of Peace, and even the physical damage buff was really nice, but would they be able to compete with some of the changes? Like, you know, we got Vengeance and Bear rising up. I mean, think about that. Think about what we're talking about. Vengeance and Bear looked at the 2 worst tanks, now potentially the 2 best tanks for Mythic Plus. So what does that do to Brewmaster, where Brewmaster was almost only sitting there on the periphery just because of their defensive prowess? Now when you have tanks doing so much offense, bringing so much besides just defense, what does that do to Brewmaster? I'm not entirely sure, but I do think I'm sure to say that they're still going to be a perennial pick for raiding. We'll see. Obviously not in a raiding situation where I could make that claim, but I think, you know, if we had a Brewmaster, like if I could transform all my interest from Blood DK back into Brewmaster, I could easily see it being a really strong idea to bring a Brewmaster to any kind of content that's going to do repeatable physical damage that your group overall is going to maybe have some trouble dealing with. But why should you pick this tank? I think the theme of Brewmaster is very strong right now. I really like the concepts that were re-added in Shadowlands, and I think if you're a fan of Brewmaster from the past, or just kind of a fan of the idea of a Brewmaster monk, like, you know, staggering, kind of like a, you know, the whole theme with beer and drunkenness and all this, I think it comes through really well this expansion, and them re-adding certain things has really made me interested in playing Brewmaster again. Great, so that's all my thoughts collected on all 6 tanks. I hope that type of side-by-side comparison can give you a better feel and help you make your own opinions on the tanks and what you want to play and do in Shadowlands. Next, we're going to try to answer some more specific questions, try to get a little bit more in-depth on some of these topics. So try to answer some of these that have been submitted from the community. Also have a couple that I think most people are asking, seeing on the forums and stuff like that. So let's start with the question that everybody should be asking. What is the most fun tank to play in Shadowlands? Let's talk about all 6 of them and why I find them fun. Blood DK is obviously my favorite tank, and the reason I find it the most fun is because there's these windows of insane planning that really pay off to the point where you might not even need any other players in your group to succeed. This was really true in things like WoD and Legion, and it was mostly true in BFA, but I think it's back to where we want to see it in Shadowlands. So once we get, a good amount of stats and everything gets, the dust is settled, Blood DK is going to be really active again, really self-reliant. They had buffed Death Strike multiple times throughout the beta. It's doing an insane amount of healing if you watch my stream. So that's my reason for Blood DK. Not everybody will like that. Not everybody will like that play style of, almost not needing a healer if you play well, but being completely crushed. No, the healer will never be able to save you otherwise. For me, I've always really liked that concept. I always thought it was very unique. And you could say maybe the same thing for Vengeance. Why would Vengeance be fun? It would be because they have a nice kit that really works around that. You feel like you're doing a lot of self-healing, but you can also do a lot of offense. I would say probably the most fun thing about Vengeance, though, is that burst window there with Fell Devastation. It's just so fun. And also, jumping around, getting ahead of your group, being very active tank it's a really fun thing. In terms of, let's say Brewmaster, they're really sturdy. If you get a really good Celestial Brew, it's just such a great moment. I love that concept back in the day with Guard, and I'm so glad that it's back again. Prop Paladin is also really fun for me right now because, being able to actually throw some healing out to the group is something that I absolutely love. Whether or not it ever becomes a main focus of the spec, we'll see, but it's just so nice. And, they have good burst offense. You might like the Crusader style, especially with some of the talents and stuff. So I just love seeing those shields bounce around, though. I have to admit, Kyrie and Paladin might as well be a lock for me. I can say the same thing about Prot Warrior, the whole kind of like leaping around. They have a really good feel, like a really good theme to them. It's almost like if they're, really defined physically and both like the way they look as well. But I just never really liked the buttons. For me, they were always a little clunky. I felt like you're oftentimes spamming the same button, and it's very like almost formulaic. You don't even really need to generate rage much, at least, especially in BFA, but in Shadowlands, it feels kind of the same way. You're generating this resource so passively that it's almost like you're playing like a rogue or more like a DPS spec at times, and it just doesn't seem as engaging to me, especially compared to Blood DK. Like, imagine if Blood DK just like randomly acquired runic power from getting hit, like how different the spec would be. And finally, Bear is probably the tank that most people look at as the least fun, but I would still say that it's got a lot of cool moments to it. I love the theme of it. I love the fact that it's a freaking bear. That's just so, it's always been an awesome theory to think about in WoW, being able to actually be an animal and fight in combat. It's so cool. Not Cap, but Bear is really cool. I really do think that people will find Bear to be more fun this expansion, though, because some of their legendaries and talents getting reworked is just such a huge boon for them, and I think it'll be really good. But so for me, Blood DK is tier 1, number 1 fun. Vengeance and Brewmaster are really fun, and everything else than that is, I can find a lot of fun in it if I really wanted to play it strongly. But I think for the most players, they will find the more active tanks fun. So that might be Vengeance, that might be maybe something like Prop Pally, maybe something like Blood DK. So explore what you think is the best. Think about how you like them in BFA, and then you can probably just extrapolate upon that, and it's really you'll be able to see the strengths immediately in Shadowlands. All right, first question we'll take from the viewers here. For a semi-casual player looking to move from 15 to 16 range to the 20 range, which tank is easiest and also most difficult to make that transition? I was struggling with Blood DK above 16s and 17s due to damage spikes getting massive. Probably a lot to do with poor play as well. And yeah, that's the thing about Blood DK. It is definitely poor play, but it's hard to play well. Blood DK requires a lot of planning, and the more gear you have, the more comfortable you can get with it, the more you can push. So I would probably say Blood DK might be the hardest tank if you're already not confident. If you feel like you're going into the expansion with some bad memories of Blood DK, probably just leave that one at number 6, even though I think it's the most fun tank and very rewarding. If you don't feel like you're able to play it at that level, then it's probably, you're probably right about that. It's probably not the tank I would focus on. The easiest tank for Shadowlands, I would definitely say, is just Vengeance, especially if you've been playing Blood, because you've been already used to the healing playstyle, kind of the, you supplement the healer's heals with your heals, and also make, some big plays with soloing and stuff like that. Vengeance is a lot different than Blood, though, but I think you'd probably get used to it quick, especially if you're interested in like a really active tank. You feel like you have a lot more control over your own survival as Vengeance than you do any of the other 4 tanks besides Blood DK. So it's a really good pick right now. They're really strong, so I would suggest that to you. If you're not looking for Vengeance, you might find Bear as number 2 to be the best option, because they're very bulky, physically bulky, very basic, almost kind of too basic. A lot of people criticize them as too simple, but I think it's a really good place to start for a new player, especially somebody who's new to tanking and looking to elevate their gameplay. And right now, I don't think they've ever been better. The outlook on them is high. I think they're going to be looked at as a relatively good meta pick, and most importantly, they have some incredibly strong legendaries and talents that are really going to make them fun to play in small group content there. So I would definitely consider either Vengeance if you like really offensive and active tanks, or Bear if you like kind of more passive and just kind of wally, never really take any damage tanks. Past that, it would probably be a toss-up. know, I don't know who I would recommend, but I would say like maybe Brewmaster, then maybe Prot Warrior, then maybe Prot Paladin. And that's just because, you know, in that order, they have a little bit more control over their HP, a little bit easier time with defense, and they're not really, there's not really any expectations there for any of the three. So whichever you prefer. But yeah, those would be probably the easiest would be Vengeance and Blood, or Vengeance and Bear, and the hardest would probably be Blood right now, unfortunately. This is a good one. Are there any tanks who are more or less suited to both Mythic Plus and rating due to build legendaries, blah, blah, blah? For example, Vengeance is looking great for Mythic Plus, but many people have mentioned it seems less ideal for raiding compared to other tanks. Again, asking from a semi-casual perspective, i.e. heroic raid and 15s. Now that is an interesting question. I don't know if I could answer that question because I've never really thought about like whether or not you're doing something other than progression raiding as a choice for a tank. Like for me, I play Blood DK regardless, so I would say find the tank that you like the most, and it will work in both raiding and 5-mans, especially if you're not doing mythic raids. But if there was actually a question of that, you'd want to identify which tank you feel like brings the most besides their core objectives to both contents, right? So that might be Bear to me, and it sounds a little weird, but in 5-mans already they're very potent, they bring a lot, but in raids they bring some interesting utility, right? First of all, battle res on a tank is really nice. I've really adored having it as a Blood DK in raids, especially when a melee dies. It's just so much easier to instantly battle res them. But besides that, they bring Stampeding Roar, which is always good. It's even useful for clearing trash too. Like it's kind of something that I wish we had more of in our raid, because the times when we could use it is never. It's always like an endless amounts of opportunity to use that. You could also potentially do that as a more off-spec role too. Like if you find yourself playing Vengeance the whole time and you don't want to be a melee DPS, well that's it, you're stuck with it. But if you play a druid, you might find yourself interested in healing some raiding, maybe even damaging some raiding as Bombkin, not feral of course, but yeah, you know, there's plenty of options with druid. So I would say that it's a really good option for this because it's a more flexible tank. It's looking very strong in Mythic Plus anyway, and I think in raiding, you know, even though it might not be looked at as the best tank, I don't know, time will tell. I think it's a very sturdy pick, and it brings more than just actual tanking to the group, which might be beneficial if you're pugging. People might be more, oh, we need a battle res, you know, more battle res is the better. Maybe in the future there's even more value, because I feel like druid is the class that always had this kind of like intangibility about them. Having more druids was always good historically for a variety of reasons. And also, you know, I keep forgetting to mention this, but Heart of the Wild in raiding is going to be incredibly valuable. Heart of the Wild, you could do a lot of healing with that as a tank. If you're not tanking, you could shift out and do a ton of healing. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, I would say druid. Next we have, please analyze the uptime of the active mitigation on prop paladins and how they feel when it's down. I can't do that. I'm not a mathematician. I will not be able to give you a mathematical answer. I'm sure there's plenty of logs out there that can, but I will tell you this. When I played prop pally, I had a lot of trouble with defense, and that's just because it's always a struggle to figure out, should I use Shield of the Righteous for offense? Should I use it for defense? Should I use Wings to make a big offensive splash, or should I save it just in case I need it? Like for me, when I play Blood DK, it's pretty clear when I should use Dancing Rune Weapon. But other than that, everything is just both offense and defensive equally, and you have enough pacing in between them that you could make the right choice. I don't feel like not death striking a few times is going to be a massive loss on offense, because it's really just a single target spell at its core, even though it's one of your highest damaging abilities. It's kind of the opposite. Like say if Blood Boil was your main defense, and at times it could be, but like it's just a passive defensive component, so you're going to use it as often as you can for the offensive benefit, and there's no real detriment there's no reason to save it, is my point, right? Where prop pally, like you have to make these decisions, especially with certain talents, and you know, if you get procs of different things, it makes it difficult. And even with the Kyrian ability, like it's still a decision that you have to make. Do we want to use this for pure offense? Do we want to use this in a situation where you could interrupt a bunch of things? Like there's a lot of decision making with prop paladin, and I feel like their baseline defensive kit is already not good. So when you don't make these decisions well, I think this is the hardest tank in the game to play. Like Blood DK is oftentimes looked at as a very difficult decision maker and getting punished for its decisions, but I think prop pally is just as bad, because if you make your decisions poorly, like if you go full offense and then you're just a sitting duck, you don't have anything to back you up other than like some crazy big CDs that are really long cooldowns. So I'm not necessarily against prop pally. I think, you know, it's a very fun tank, but I do feel like they are the worst tank for that, what you just asked about. How do they feel when it's down? That kind of sentiment there. I just can't get my head around them, because I feel like if you're in content that is going to challenge your health pool, you have to substantially sell out for it and limit all the other things that I really find cool about them. Now, Paul and his cat would like to know which tank has the best rotational flow. For instance, does one feel more impactful when pressing a button versus just spamming? It's a weird question. I wasn't sure how to answer this, but I think the answer that he hopefully will be looking for is which tank has the most fun window of both offense and defense combined. And for me, that would definitely be Vengeance right now. They have such an insane window there with Fell Devastation, Demonic, and all the stuff that they can do with Metamorphosis. Depends on what covenant you take, of course, but there's some really, really fun things there. And then the spells are looking visual, visually impressive. They're visceral. They make a really big impact on the screen and on the DPS chart. So I feel like that has the best interaction if we're talking about like what spell has like the most impact both offensively and defensively. If we're talking about just what's the coolest spell to pick though in Shadowlands, that would definitely be Divine Toll with Prop Paladin. It is so freaking cool seeing those shields go bouncing all around and potentially interrupting like dozens of targets. I mean, it depends on how many targets you're facing, but there's a couple times in the raid where I could see this ability being very useful if you're playing Prop Paladin in terms of like the whole pressing a button versus just spamming. I'm not really sure what that means, but I assume we're talking about like CDs and big CDs and stuff like this. So those are the two. But if you ask me like which tank has the best kind of like button by button rotation, I would say of course Blood DK. I love the way it works. Generate a little runic power, make that decision. Do you want to use it on offense? Do you want to save it for a couple seconds to give it a big death strike, get a bigger death strike? You have to time that all. So I feel like those kind of interactions are way people don't really look at them as much, and they think like, oh, this tank isn't very fun. It's a little kind of a weak, flimsy, something like that. I think those interactions are what make it fun for me. Question here, do you feel all tanks are balanced enough to do Mythic 10 or 15 and get AOTC? Of course, obviously. I mean, the content isn't that difficult. People act like the game is like so out of balance, but it's really not. I think what most people misunderstand when they're thinking about balance is what the community perception of balance is, and that is a very big difference than what Blizzard's actual reality is with balancing. Like, if the content is so difficult that you couldn't do it, then they would have to fix that, right? Like, there's no way that a tank could be so bad that it cannot be brought, like literally cannot tank a 5-man or literally cannot tank a raid. That's just impossible, right? So what you're talking about there is more of a community perception, and that's something that nobody can control. There's always going to be people who are looking for what the best possible option is, but in reality, the best possible option, especially in the tank role for raiding especially, is probably almost insignificant to the worst possible option. All you have to do is taunt and use defensives in heroic, so there's really not much there to consider at all. So I would say absolutely, emphatically yes. Don't even think a second about it. Play the tank that you enjoy the most and have fun. I know one covenant will always be the best for Specker class, but are they balanced enough for the average player to pick the one they want? Beyond that, yeah, I mean, it's not even really that true, honestly. I don't think there's going to be a best, and we're talking about a mathematical, factual best. People are going to try to use math to say which one is better or worse, but in reality, there's way too many scenarios, and a lot of this system is just stuff that doesn't directly impact your offense. Like, if you're talking about which one is numerically best for even a DPS spec, you're still ignoring all the other utility things that covenant could be offering, which another covenant might not be able to offer, and vice versa. It's just a silly thing to even be saying. There's way too many decisions in this one decision to actually be saying which one is mathematically the best. You absolutely should pick this. Now, of course, there might be some outliers in some departments, whether it's soulbinds, conduits, or actual spells, but it's going to get changed, okay? They already released an article about this. Like, they will be updating anything that's a major outlier, okay? So find the one that you like. Do not worry about what anyone else says. If anything, pick the one that you identify with the most, or if you really worry about it, pick the one that you feel like you want to do the dungeons the most on, because there is going to be that might be the most imbalanced thing about the whole system, actually, is the spells or the buffs that you could do in the dungeons as the specific covenant. But otherwise, pick the one you want. Never look back. All right, let's go through Ivan's questions. Number 1, which tank do you feel has the most complete kit for Mythic Plus to push high keys, and why? Is there a diversity in playstyle? Vengeance Demon Hunter is absolutely the answer. They have the most complete kit of any tank right now. They have so many different options, so many different answers to so many things, and I do think there is quite a lot of diversity in their toolkit. Some talents and legendaries and even covenant abilities can really change the way they play and the way they interface with danger, and I think if you're completely green on this topic and you're looking for something to play with this in mind, I would definitely recommend Vengeance. Number 2, which tank do you feel has the most complete kit for Mythic progression rating, and why? Is there diversity in playstyle? I might actually say Blood DK, because they have a lot of different options with legendaries, even some talents like Mark of Blood. So they have a lot of things that they can do to interact with the raid. But the one thing I'm really excited for is going to be throwing that AMZ down and making a big impact. It's a really satisfying feeling. I've already been doing it in Nyalotha. It really feels like it adds to our healing core. So unless the raids are suddenly like 10 times harder to heal, I feel like this is going to be a really valuable thing to have. And of course, it's my main, so what could I say? In terms of diversity and playstyle, I mean, there's some options. Blood DK is historically not known for its great options, but I do think the different legendaries make it a little bit different, a little bit more interesting. And whether or not you take the Vamp Blood legendary being up to you, I think that could be a really fun thing to do in raid as well. And 3, how would you recommend to approach the game the first 2 weeks to be best prepared for Mythic content rated Mythic Plus? I mean, which content would you prioritize to get an optimal preparation? That's not a question that I should answer. There's actually a dude, guy Medivh. I made videos on this topic before, but I don't think we'll have time to do one again. It's a really good thing. Look this up, Medivh's Lexicon or something like that. And it's really, he's got all the answers to that. But yeah, long story short, just get to max level, do Torghast, get prepared, get some gear from Mythic Zeros, and get ready to go. Question here, aren't all tanks viable up to a certain key level? Say I really want to play Blood DK and mostly aiming for 15 to get achievements. Blood DK are usually ranked really low, but aren't all tanks viable up to a certain level? Yes, so the question here is not, you're misunderstanding what viable means. I think a lot of people misuse it. Don't feel bad about this, but what people are usually talking about here is actually optimal. Like any tank is viable for any content. I mean, you could theoretically do content without a tank. You know what I mean? It doesn't really, like, there's not like some kind of forced rule about having a certain tank. It's just when people are talking about like really competitive content, they're talking about like minimal differences between tanks, making it so that they can actually compete in these things. You know what I mean? Like realistically, even if you had to literally never get hit by a boss, you could probably do that at some tanks. Like you can just kite for 100% of the dungeon and you could still finish keys. Whether or not that's going to be a sustainable source of upgrading keys is the question, right? So, you know, for I think most people, Blood DK is looked at a tank that's just not going to survive the physical damage very well. They're not going to be able to survive the damage income on some of those harder difficulties of keys, but certainly in all content that's meant to be done, like, you know, mythic rating, you know, even probably up to 20, like you're saying, this tank is perfectly clear. You know, it's a clear choice. You can pick it, no problem. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just like compared to maybe, you know, if you compare the top to the bottom, there's obviously some differences there that might influence which you pick and which people want to take. It's not that just because the bottom is the bottom, it's not viable, meaning it cannot do the content. It just means it's not optimal, meaning it might not be the best pick. Now we got rapid fire here. One question is, how do you think the tanks will scale with stats as the expansion progresses? Which tank scales well and which ones do not? My inclination is always to say that Blood DK is going to get really strong as they get more gear, because the more strength, more armor, more stamina they have, everything gets better. Whereas most tanks, you know, they already have kind of a good baseline of these things. They don't necessarily need more stamina. They don't necessarily need more armor. It helps them, obviously, but I think it helps Blood DK the most. So I always feel like Blood DK is a tank that scales the best. And I think you could see that pretty clearly in Legion and even BFA too, but of course it gets blurred with the corruption thing. I think they definitely get better though, every patch. Now, one way to look at it is which ones do not. And that question I don't actually know if I could answer. I think maybe the tank that scales the worst historically has just been Bear, because when every other tank is kind of coming into their own, Bear is kind of just, they don't really have that electric moment that the spec features, so there's never really anything to look forward to. But I don't know much about actual like mathematical scaling, that kind of thing. I have no idea about, especially don't forget, considering there's going to be the secondary stat scaling situation here where you're going to have diminishing returns on collecting secondaries. This might heavily impact tanks, especially with versatility. So we'll see how that plays out. His next question is, which tanks are better for pugs and which are better in organized group? For me, pugs are always about making sure you have the tools to solo the dungeon if you possibly can, because the pugs may be completely incompetent. They may not know anything. They may make a lot of mistakes. So tanks with lots of interrupts, that would be Prop Pally, Blood DK, Vengeance, etc. Tanks with lots of self-sustain, that would be Blood DK, Vengeance, maybe Prop Pally, maybe Bear. Tanks with lots of tools to make up for mistakes, obviously Battle Res is key number 1, so that's Blood Decay, could also be Bear. A lot of things like maybe Gorfine's Grasp could have like intangible benefit, AMZ, intangible benefit, just the tank that you feel like you can do the most on besides pure offense and defense. A lot of times I was hoping that could have been Prop Pally because of how much potential healing they could put out to the group at the cost of your own survival. But you know, I don't really know for sure. It depends a lot more on what you want to do as a tank, and like literally if you think you can solo the dungeon as a prot warrior, then that's the answer for you, right? Like it's just all about, in a vacuum, what can you do the most on, and then which are better for organized groups. That's obviously going to be the tank that's like kind of the most sturdy, the one that fills the role the most distinctly. So in the past it's been the tank that has the most, you know, straightforward viable options for offense, and that's been Prot Warrior and Brewmaster, because they bring a lot more to the table than other tanks in that row, and they're also very bulky defensively. That's what those groups need. But if we're talking about an organized group that's just doing a 15, then it's just the same thing as we were talking about with pugging, because you still want to be able to make the big play if that organized group suddenly turns into chaos. And also which healer pairs well with which tank. So it's a long question to answer, but I would say the tank that you want the most healing for is usually going to be Brewmaster, so you will oftentimes see Resto Druid pairing really well with them, because the hot model kind of almost counteracts the stagger model. Brewmaster is really good with that. You could also see Guardian Druid being really well with that because of the mastery, kind of increasing the hots, making them slightly more potent each tick. That can also be useful. You might also see a lot of Disc Priest usage this time around, mostly because it seems like it's kind of getting in the meta. It's been nerfed a few times somewhat recently though, so I'm concerned with that. But for Blood Decay especially, I always like a healer that can bring more than just healing. That's something like big offense, big utility, you know, something more valuable than just healing, because a lot of times I don't need them to heal me. So that would either be something like Holy Paladin, Resto Shaman, or maybe Disciplined Priest, especially this season. They just bring a lot more than just healing, and you don't really need the healing all the time. But you want to identify what your core strengths and weaknesses are as a tank. Like for example, I've heard Jix say a lot that like Vengeance really needs that external CD at times. So playing with the Resto Druid or Priest, or you know, something that has a strong external is going to really work compared to something that doesn't, like maybe a Resto Shaman. Whereas Blood Decay, I'd rather Resto Shaman because they have Rock Elemental to save me on packs that I'm not confident on. They have Spirit Link to really equalize my health, especially on a week like Necrotic, which is I feel like my main counter, you know, all that kind of thing. You have to just think about what you lack as a tank and what the healer can bring to make up for that. Jordan asks, how does Door of Shadows feel as a Blood Death Knight? Do you feel it helps with the mobility issues DK has, or does the cast time really only make it useful for initial pulls? How does it feel compared to Night Fae? This is a question that I hate to answer this way, but it's just, the answer is just not good. Yeah, it just doesn't feel good at all. I really cannot stand, basically like, you know, the cast is almost as long as the portal is. Like, you're not actually going to get that much value out of using that. The main thing is it can go upwards and kind of, you know, kind of break the three-dimensional laws of travel in the game. So there's probably times when it's incredibly valuable, but it's nothing special. Like, I didn't feel like it was very good at all. And in fact, the only time I ever even considered using it was when it was actually a soul bind that made it instant. If it was instant, then it would be extremely good, and then we'd be talking about it here. But in my opinion, it's just worse in every way than Night Fae. But of course, if you're taking Venthyr, then you will find uses for it. Yes, you can take, there's a couple soul binds that make it a lot more valuable, but most so you could use it to get to the pack quicker than the rest of your group at times. It just, there's a lot of things that make it difficult. Like for me, I felt like a lot of times it said like path not found, or you know, however that's worded. So like I'd be sitting there spamming it and I wasn't going anywhere. A lot of times I'd be behind the pack, like the group's progression anyway, so they'd be in front of me, and then I'd stop, and maybe it's like causing some confusion. They're like probably like, why is he stopping back there? Or maybe they keep going and I don't get there in time anyway, and then like the mobs just run right by me. It's just a very imprecise ability, and frankly, I feel like its only real value is going to either be to like skip over layers of the world, like, you know, to move upward, or for very specific boss mechanics, like in a raid that you know beforehand. But yeah, in my opinion, Night Fae, I mean, one of the main reasons I'm going Night Fae is because of the signature ability there. Being able to blink as any class has been ridiculously good in the past. I mean, in Legion, you might remember there were multiple mechanics that you could actually blink to avoid. I don't think that will happen again in Shadowlands, and even if it did as a tank, I can't imagine imagine I'd be far enough away to actually make that happen. There's so many good soulbind traits to make that even better, and it's just got so much flavor to it. I love the concept of it. I love the fact that you could choose different animals or however that's going to work. So for me, yeah, it's just way better. I wouldn't base the decision on the Covenant on any of these signature abilities alone. Pretty much all 4 can be very good for a variety of reasons, but in terms of how does it feel, I don't feel like it particularly helps with the mobility issues at all. Daniel asks, what's your thought process when going into a dungeon? Is there specifics you look into and adjust? Does this change when you have a group comp you're more comfortable playing with, and does it change whether you're in voice chat or not? That is a very good question, more specific about Mythic Plus than tanking, but I do think that having a concise thought process, something that you know you need to address in the dungeon as a tank, is a key element of dungeon success, whether you're pugging or in voice, for sure. When you're playing a tank, you always need to have a plan for everything in the dungeon. You could wing that plan, I do so often, but you have to have some kind of plan. You have to be able to think on your feet one way or the other. You can't just go in there and have no idea what you're doing. So for me, my thought process going into a dungeon is always, where can we minimize the mistakes? Where can we, if we've had a mistake before, like a Tall Desire, there's so many examples in a Tall Desire where people want me to do all these weird things, but I know I've seen mistakes. I know exactly what's going to happen. If we do it the way I'm comfortable, it's going to be a lot easier for me to minimize those mistakes. That's the tank. I can't control anyone else. But of course, if we're in voice playing with the guild group, I'm much more interested in playing to their strengths than just my strengths. But when you're pugging, unfortunately, you have to be the confident one of the pack. You can't rely on others to do it for you. So having that plan in your head before you start is absolutely vital. But last question, how do you think this thought process changes between all tanks? It certainly would. I can't say I haven't played a lot of tanks at the same level, but for Blood DK, obviously you know your strengths and weaknesses. You know where you're going to have a trouble. Like if we did a certain affix set on a certain dungeon, I'd be thinking about, where am I going to die in this dungeon? What's going to be the hardest part of this dungeon for me? And I might actually adjust how I approach the entire dungeon because of that. Minimizing that one big mistake is actually going to save the key. Whereas just going in and callously saying like, oh, I'll be fine, we'll figure it out when we get there, that could be absolutely the end of the run. So for other tanks, they'd also see the same, hopefully develop. They'd know where their weaknesses and where their strengths can shine, and they'd be planning around them. Here we have an interesting question about professions. What profession would support tanking in Shadowlands the most for Blood Death Knights? Because I'd imagine it'd be different for different tanks. The question is one that is interesting. I'm just not sure how I would approach it, depending on what you mean by support. Like if you're talking about which profession should you get as a Blood DK, there's only one or two really that you should even consider, right? I mean, you're not going to take tailoring, right? You're not going to take leatherworking. So what could you consider? You consider blacksmithing. Blacksmithing obviously has a really good value this expansion. Make those sharpening stones. You could make actual legendaries, maybe even potentially gear, especially in the future. We'll see what they do with the systems. But do you need that for your tank? No, of course not. You can just buy all that stuff yourself. So what I always like to do as a dungeon runner and historically have gravitated towards was herbalism and alchemy, because it allows you to have a lot more control over potions. Historically, there's been things that allow you to get like procs to get even more potions. A lot of people have always put like a flat value on potions, even though you can get procs from them. They'll still charge the exact same regardless. So I always thought it was kind of a racket, honestly. Like, why buy a potion when I could accidentally get 10 potions, for the same amount of materials? So for me, doing a lot of dungeons, I feel like alchemy is a really good thing to have. The extra flask duration too, if you're doing long chaining, has always been good. But if it was up to me, if I could keep alchemy somehow in my DK and also take blacksmithing, I would. I really wanted blacksmithing for this expansion. I had to end up deciding to do it on my paladin tank, my paladin alt that is, and we'll see if I end up using it too much. I'm not really sure how expensive these items are going to be, but for me, somebody who plans on making many different legendaries, I really do not plan on playing enough to be generating that kind of gold. I'd rather be able to just make them myself, not spend millions of gold on somebody else's materials, and the best way to do that would be with a profession that I could control. And that would be what I recommend for all tanks. Like if you're sure that you can make the money you need to buy all these things, then go for it. But for me, I have a lot of free time, a lot of hours that I can play. So I figure I might as well just take professions on different characters that can attribute to me getting the legendaries I want on first my main and then my alts. Tager asks, how does each tank elevate the pace in dungeons? What would you aim to do with each tank specifically to increase the pace and success of a group? So this is actually a great question. This is something I used to cover all the time on the actual tank tier list I used to do. Elevating the pace of the dungeon is really the job of the tank. Like I would say that, you know, keeping threat and surviving are secondary to this. If you're doing a timed run, you have to elevate the pace, meaning you can't constantly be opening your map and looking to see what's next. You can't constantly be second guessing yourself. You have to have a clear, concise vision of what you're going to do after you're doing the thing you're doing right now. So clearly there's a couple tanks that are better for this. Right now, Vengeance and Brewmaster obviously stand out as some of the best ones because they have some insane mobility and they have low CD, big impact stuff that they could do really often through each pack, so they never feel like they're in danger pack to pack. They have an answer frequently. Blood DK, kind of the opposite at times. It depends on the style of pack. Like if it's something that you could get a lot of interrupts and magic damage in, then you're pretty comfortable. But if we're talking about successful, hard-hitting packs, sometimes you have to be a little bit more deliberate. So elevating the pace isn't always the easiest thing, especially when you have low mobility. This is one of the main reasons I'm going Night Fae, because it's going to give me more access to defense pack to pack with Death and Decay, the changes for that being much more widely accessible than the other options, and of course the signature ability that's going to allow me to get even more mobility. So these are the questions that if you're interested in this topic, you need to be asking yourself, how can I not only play the class but augment the class to be able to increase the success using pace control, meaning like anytime you could make a big play with your speed or your pulling, you should be trying to do it. A lot of times you see things like combining packs when you have CDs up. So that's a really finesse thing. You can do it obviously, but in pugs, it might backfire horrifically. We saw it a lot with Fire Mage, of course, you know, that whole nonsense that we had going on at the end of season 4, constantly complaining about combustion, but it's probably going to be somewhat similar. People were talking about it with, you know, Destro Warlock and other specs that are going to be really bursty in Shadowlands. You might be considering this whole thing yet again. And this is actually, I think a lot of tanks have a lot of good access to it right now. So really, you're just looking to be thinking ahead. It's not really something that you need to be worried about what class you're picking, whether you're Blood, whether you're Prot Warrior, it doesn't matter. Just always be thinking ahead, thinking about when you're going to use your CDs and then what's coming up. Like for example, I just did this in the other side the other day. There's a pack, the CDs that I have that I need are up for every single time. I've done this the exact same way and it's always up, but I shouldn't use it there because right after that pack, there's a much more dangerous and much more important pack coming up. So this is an example of a situation where sitting on CDs can actually yield a net pace increase. But typically I would say, like people ask all the time, you know, what should I do with CDs? No, you should never sit on them, especially as a Blood DK or maybe other tanks too. You want to be using these CDs as often as you can because any usage of them is just elevating the pace of the dungeon, either freeing up healing, you know, could now go to actual offense from HPS to DPS, also just, you know, less stress and maybe the overall feel of the dungeon goes better. But for many situations, this is the kind of stuff you have to consider. You have to be preparing ahead of time. So consider Covenant or Conduit choices that are going to help with that. And I think you'll see a noticeable difference, even just on a long scale average, like not dungeon to dungeon, but something over months. You'll notice that it'll be more comfortable for you, more comfortable for your groups to succeed without you having to overwork. And last question here, Thomas Banks asks, was this live? Did I miss it? No, this is a pre-recorded video, not a live stream. So that's everything. I got to a lot of questions, didn't get to all of them. If you have further questions, please leave them down below. I try to answer any and all questions. I try never to let anything go unturned. So if there's anything you have any questions about at all, let me know. I will help you. That's my main goal here, is to help people, not necessarily to tell people what to do, but to help them make the decision themselves. Use my opinion to formulate your opinion, and we all get better because of it. Either way, I hope this has helped, and I hope you look forward to tanking in Shadowlands as much as I do. The dungeons, especially in Shadowlands, are the best I've ever done. I honestly can't recommend them enough. They're so good. I keep saying this, but I hope I won't regret saying it. There's just no dungeon that I dislike. In BFA and Legion, there was dungeons that I absolutely hated. There was some that I absolutely loved, but at least so far in Shadowlands, I don't really feel that way about any one dungeon. And honestly, the raid is looking like maybe the best raid ever in my book too. So I'm really looking forward to all this. I hope you are too. If you have any questions or anything I can help you with, please let me know. Otherwise, thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.